Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. And I'm George Binns. And the guest this evening is City Councilor at Large for the City of Beverly, Hannah Bowen. Welcome, Hannah.
Thanks, George. Good to be here.
And we were having some preliminary discussions, and we traded emails about it. And one of the concerns, I guess, you expressed was about Pete's Park. And this has popped up, and the day we record this show is the 8th of April. And so in today's Salem News, there's a letter to the editor from a Dr. Carrie Pound. And she is a native of the area, and it was talking about what's going on there. And she's raising a good point that here's a bunch of kids, high school kids. They probably think they're adults, but they're kids to me. And they got together and decided, hey, why don't we have a basketball game on this half court? That the city modified the park to include a half court basketball court. So how do you use it? And they came up with a good idea. And all of a sudden it sounds like, and again, the whole story hasn't rolled out yet, that some of the abutters were a little concerned about the noise and a bunch of kids there. And they called the director of playgrounds to come down and look at it. And it did not go well on a Saturday morning. And since then, the city has backpedaled and said, yeah, we're going to do something different. But I guess the question comes down to is, okay, the city's got parks all over the place. And there's always going to be some sort of disagreement as to is that the proper use of the park. I guess from the city council's point of view, how do we establish a park with a set of acceptable ground rules from the beginning so everybody knows in advance when you have to get a permit and when you don't have to? And how does this stuff get resolved?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's been talk of the town all week. And I think it raises some bigger questions about how do we use our public space, because you're right. I mean, a public park has to balance the needs of the neighbors with the needs of everyone using the park, who may be immediate neighbors, they may be from any part of the city, they may even be from outside of the city. Some of our parks, Lynch Park, for example, draw people from all over the area. And it's wonderful that we can offer those spaces. And I think we've seen over the last couple of years how important outdoor spaces in particular are. And today's letter to the editor points out just the toll that the last couple of years have taken, particularly on young people's mental health, and how having outlets and places to go and places where they feel free and welcome and safe are so important. So I think, from the city council level, our role in helping navigate what public spaces we invest city funds in and how we manage them is really to host the public conversations about expectations. What are we looking for? How are we going to use these spaces? Whose needs need to be balanced? And how do we set up common sense rules that people understand and have easy access to? So I think some of the issues that have come up out of this situation are things like, people don't know when a permit is needed or not. The signage at the parks doesn't really guide you to understand that. Finding things on the website can be difficult. So some of the things that might have prevented this specific situation and the issues around permitting, we can work on and fix. But I think there's just a bigger issue, too, around how we're providing services for young people and how we're treating each other as neighbors. Because when I was going around knocking doors during campaign season, was up in that neighborhood and heard mostly things like in today's letter and what I've heard from constituents over the last week, that people love having that park in the neighborhood, love that it was redone in a way that makes it accessible to any and all kinds of people and families, and that it's being used so well. And there were also neighbors at that time, and I know, that's not new. They've been saying the same thing for a couple of years now, who are bothered by the noise, who are worried about, more cars in the neighborhood, trash being left. And those are real concerns that we can address, but my hope is that we can address them in a neighborly way and not be putting city staff, whether it's the Parks Department or the Police Department, in the position of having to judge a situation and try and appease neighbors on the one hand and young people on the other hand, when it's probably a situation that could be dealt with, individually in the moment, a learning opportunity. If kids are leaving trash or parking the wrong way, let's talk about it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a punitive thing. And I think, the young people who came to the city council meeting on Monday were great advocates for having that free and open space and not having neighbors sort of look at them funny, like, what are you doing here in my park next to my house? Just some of that kind of bigger, how are we encouraging the use of that space rather than limiting it? And how our first reaction in seeing something that, maybe, okay, there's a large group, is that organized or not? For our first reaction to be, how do we make this work rather than how do we clear this park of kids?
Well, I think part of the issue comes down to one of the neighbors didn't know what was going on, and all of a sudden it sounds like a bunch of kids showed up. Well, what are they going to do?
And I think, I hope around the city, when I look at our young people, they've been through a lot. We all have.
Yeah.
But, if they're out getting some exercise, getting some fresh air, doing something fun, we should look at that and be thrilled. And anyone who looks at that and is bothered, it makes me wonder, what assumptions are running through their heads and why, and how can we work on that, too?
That's a preconceived notion of, okay, you got a bunch of kids out there.
They're going to cause trouble. And I hope we don't jump to those conclusions.
I think these kids, are doing a good job in saying that, hey, when we all get together, we're going to play basketball. They're going to do something. They organize something. And there's a lot of good that comes out of this. And some of the other comments in the press have been highlighting the fact that they did something. Mm-hmm. They took advantage of a facility and made it even better.
Yeah.
And that's what you hope for. That's why you build these things.
Yep.
And I think that's part of the message that has to get out. And it's one of these communication problems of there's a bunch of kids showed up. What are they going to do here? Well, we're going to have a basketball league.
Right.
And I think a lot of people would have said, oh, that's nice.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad that the young people who were involved in this particular situation last weekend and the director of Parks and Rec and the mayor sat down and worked out a solution. It sounds like they're going to continue playing there and the neighbors are now aware. And that's great, but that also happened as a specific meeting about this specific situation and these specific kids. And, I hope, and the city council plans to take this up, to just kind of look over, are our permitting rules clear? Could we make any updates? Now that people have been using outdoor spaces differently over the last couple of years, are there some updates that are timely? So that we have that conversation, not just, in a conference room for those 3 kids, but for the community at large.
Well, the other question comes down to, why do we need permits to use the public grounds?
Yeah.
I mean, that's where it starts. That my taxpayer dollars, your taxpayer dollars, paid for this thing, a bunch of other people too.
Yeah, and interestingly, at the Parks and Rec meeting last night, there are times when permits make good sense, especially real paid league play that are using our soccer fields and basketball courts. And there are times when it's just really helpful to avoid conflict, that somebody clearly has signed up and reserved for a certain amount of time, and we can limit for how much, and and then they take precedence. But there was a group of people there who have been advocating for a long time now for dedicated pickleball courts, and there are plans to get those in up at Birch Plains, construction later this year, ideally. And that group is saying, we really don't want permitting. This sport and this activity is a very community-driven, everybody shows up, whoever's there, spontaneous kind of thing. And, and the Parks Department was sort of saying, well, there may be times when you want permits for your own, ability to reserve, but at least the people who were there were like, no, if other people show up who want to play at the same time, great, we'll play together, we'll take turns, and we'll sort it out ourselves. And that was just a really nice attitude to see.
Well, I think, again, I grew up in the age of no bicycle helmets and all that kind of stuff. And you go knock on a kid's door and says, hey, can Johnny come out and play? And off we go and do something.
Yeah.
And didn't have all these facilities, so we made do with what's around.
Yeah.
And
I think actually on the point of facilities, because with more built up and you're dealing with cars, like just hopping on the bike and going is not necessarily as safe or people are as comfortable. So having facilities that young people can go to is so important. And we're looking now at renovations to the McPherson Youth Center, which is city-owned but managed by the Y to manage the activities and things. And that's down in the Bass River area that's also up for discussion. So I think there's some really exciting stuff we can look at there. And the mayor has talked about using some of the COVID recovery money from the federal government to fund some renovations there. They've already secured a project manager to start looking at the design process. So I'm hopeful that young people will be involved in that design process, and that some of the young people who are organizing things on their own in our existing facilities will have a voice in what goes in that space too.
Well, this whole idea of a 3-on-3 basketball is totally alien to me. I never heard of it before. And apparently it's the kind of solution that, okay, this is what we got, a half court. What can we do with it?
Yeah.
That's what you want to develop in town. And that kind of flexibility needs to be maintained so that, like you said, the pickleball people show up, and depending on who shows up, that's who plays.
Yep.
And we're all big kids. We can take turns. All this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But you bring up the other issue of, excuse me, the Bass River overlay. That's another big one that's going round and round.
Yeah.
The Ward 2 Civic Association had a meeting. Ryleside is about to have one next Tuesday.
Yeah, and they already had one a month ago or so.
Yeah. So the question, and this has been going on for some time, it's mentioned that maybe it's been 20 years somebody's been talking about doing something in that area. And the question really comes down to is, where is Beverly going and what's it going to do when it gets there?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And I don't think this has been thrashed out enough to set up an overall broad view of this is Beverly, this is where we're going. And we're being pushed from sides to say, okay, you need TOD, transient-oriented development. And had a discussion with Scott Hausman the other day. And, well, we got 4 railroad stations functioning now. We used to have 5. And my neighborhood, Montserrat, is just down the street from me.
Yep.
Is that the next one? But it's already built up. How do we adjust for this? And I guess the question is, where do you think we ought to go?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm glad that particularly around the Bass River zoning overlay discussion, that it's really, it's like grassroots up discussion now, because it's true that area has been kind of flagged for redevelopment since the 2002 master plan, and in every plan since, and it's been studied. What could go in there, what couldn't, and I think it's true that where there is already it's already built and it's along the waterway, so it is a great area for the concept of redevelopment, where you're not losing green space, you could potentially gain green space, and it's in an attractive area near both the train station and the water in downtown. So in concept, I think everybody's agreed on that the uses there now have been working and that there's space for other uses. But this question of, what level of density we're comfortable with and how quickly. So one of the things that has changed since 2002 is in those master planning conversations, from what I understand, a lot of the conversation was around building up along the Rantoul Street corridor and on the Bass River side. And there was sort of a need to start one first, see how things go, see what people are comfortable with, see what the impacts are on traffic, on public services. A lot of the questions about Bass River are, will our schools become overwhelmed? Will, police and fire be overwhelmed? So there are lessons from the Rantoul Street redevelopments. The planning department has cited a lot of their work studying, are the parking restrictions okay? Is there actually an increase in school enrollment as a result of those apartments? Is the strain on public services real? And encouragingly, it doesn't sound like that's been too bad, but the sense of the neighborhood of increased traffic and sort of just that increased feel of density, people are starting to, I think, hit a max for now and want to go a little more slowly on this next phase. So when it was originally envisioned 20 years ago, none of that was there yet.
Yeah.
And, a lot of other things have changed in the world. So I think it's good that the process is slowing down and it's really being driven by these neighborhood association meetings, bringing up, like, here's what we want to see. It hasn't all been criticism. A lot of it has been really helpful suggestions about what kind of open space could be there, what kind of city-owned property we could, look at actually acquiring more to tack on to, where you have the youth center and the parks. Like, are there other parcels in that stretch that the city could build on public infrastructure? So I think there's lots of really good ideas, and I, have sympathy for the planning department that, feel like they've been talking about this forever and are ready to go, but the city's not, and so you have to go at the pace of where the public are at to some extent.
When you say they're ready to go, we just don't know where we're going.
Right.
And as things change, I think there's more emphasis on what kind of housing are we going to put in there. And one of my pet peeves is that when they start talking about affordable housing, that's nice. But as Don Preston pointed out when he made the presentation on this, affordable housing is kind of ritzy. It doesn't cover the kind of people that are working in that area, the service industry. They're not getting paid $50,000 a year and up, or $80,000 a year. So we end up in a situation where people that work in the area have to live in New Hampshire or someplace else. And to me, it's a concept of having a complete city. On the Parking and Traffic Commission, we always talk about having complete roads, complete streets, so that pedestrians, bicycles, and cars can inhabit the area safely and friendly and conveniently. And I think of it about a complete city where everybody that works here should be able to live here someplace. And we can't keep building one-bedroom and studio condos. And granted, they don't impact the school system because you're not really going to raise a family in a one-bedroom. The few two bedrooms they have, maybe you get a couple of kids out of that. But you have to talk about an area developing, and do we have the infrastructure to support it? There isn't a market within walking distance. And again, we're talking about a city that's walkable. That's one of the other buzzwords. Well, that's nice. Where are you going to walk to? You can't. There's not a market. You can hike up to CVS if you need to go to a drugstore. That's a bit of a hike from.
The Stop and Shop's not too far.
Well, Stop and Shop.
But no, I mean, you're right. And how we think about distributing density and affordability and the different mix of housing. The other thing I'm really excited about is the accessory dwelling unit discussion. So there was a great kind of briefing / public forum on Zoom a couple of weeks ago that I know was recorded. So it's probably on the planning department's website. But really looking at how do you fit in more smaller rental units in neighborhoods that are currently single-family zoned or thereabouts, but there's space on lots to either have, a floor of a house or over the garage, or in some cases a small standalone unit.
Yeah.
And you can write an ordinance that allows any mix or some or all or none of those. And I think that would be really appropriate in neighborhoods like around the Montserrat train station, where you have some lots that maybe have space. It's not, really tall buildings, but allows some more density right within a neighborhood that has a train station, has some walkability, so isn't necessarily going to cause huge problems with traffic or things like that, and where there's some like absorptive capacity for more people, and does it in a way that generally could be cheaper because, you're not building a skyscraper from scratch, you're renovating a garage, or so it's the costs for production are not insignificant. Obviously, costs for everything are going up, but you can create those units more affordably in many cases. And then it gives options for people who, want to downsize, want some rental income, but to stay in their main home. It allows for a lot more flexibility. And I think people have gotten the sense over the last few years that the only new construction, the only new housing units coming into Beverly are in large, high rental units, and are feeling like that's not meeting all of our needs. So while I think there is still space for a few more of those buildings somewhere in the city, maybe at a slower pace, I think we've been lacking in the other types of housing production that could, converting buildings from single or two-family homes into multifamily homes, some of those sort of things. If we can find ways to make that happen across the city in ways that make sense for each neighborhood, I think that would give people the kinds of options that they're looking for, because not everybody is looking for exactly the same thing. Part of the frustration has been like that one solution. Yes, we need more housing production, but the kind of production really matters, and the variety really matters.
Yeah, and at the same time, there are development plans for Folly Hill that keep getting thrashed around and runs up against conflicting desires of the neighbors. We don't want any more traffic running through our neighborhood. The access is not that great. And I can understand the concerns about developing along the Bass River, because the escape route from the Bass River is out Route 62.
Yeah.
And I've been on 62, and it is a long, narrow parking lot a lot of times in the day. So I think the infrastructure question is one that I think is being glossed over, and it doesn't really address the situation, and people get concerned that, like I said, you can't walk to a market from downtown. Bell's Market is gone, and maybe it would have been a better idea to convert the Ford dealership into a supermarket, but that never happened. And the other question is, what kind of bus service do we have in town?
Yeah.
I mean, all these questions really, I think, are paramount to discussing how do we develop this area.
Yeah.
And just adding another apartment house, I'm not convinced that that's the way to go every time.
Yeah, and you have to think about, people who are going to live in whatever new housing goes in. What are their lives going to be like, and how do we make infrastructure match their lifestyle needs? And, the city talks a lot about sustainability. A lot of city leaders have that as a priority. And, how are we actually investing in things like real pedestrian-friendly pieces of downtown? Some of my walking route from downtown to the Cummings Center to work feels very dangerous at times. And, if we want people to get out of their cars, we have to create, you were talking about the complete streets models. We've invested in that in some parts of town, and it's great. And so expanding and with any new development, including those kinds of features, I think is key. Making it easy for people to hop from one part of the city to the other without getting in their car. Currently not so easy, but things we should be looking at.
And walking to the Cummings Center, you got to cross Route 62, Elliott Street. Yeah. And right in front of the Cummings Center, what is it, 4 lanes wide on each side going in each direction? I mean, that's a sprint to get across when the lights flash.
Yep.
But so there's a lot of issues that I think that need to be addressed, and it's not just a one-size-fits-all
Yeah.
kind of thing.
And what I find so encouraging and have really enjoyed so far in the city council role is just that there are so many great ideas out there. And that's, going to a lot of these public meetings and the number of people who've been showing up to council meetings, even committee meetings, with great ideas. It's easy to complain always, and we're here to hear the complaints as well. But I've just been really encouraged by how many great ideas are out there and how many people are willing to put in the work too and volunteer in lots of different ways around the city and make some of these things happen. So
yeah, one of the things that I personally was surprised at the discussion on Bass River, the Ward 2 Civic Council, one of the gentlemen got up and said, instead of doing an overlay, what we need to do is rezone the area. Because there's a problem if you have an overlay, somebody can come in and use the old rules in the new area, and that doesn't fit the plan. And I think people coming out of the woodwork with bright ideas that you never expected.
Yeah.
Who thought of that? I don't know.
Yeah, and that triggers another idea, and it really can build a lot. Yeah.
The other thing that is impressive is the high school seniors that came before the city council and made their case.
Yep.
And they did a smooth job, and no ranting and raving or anything like that. They organized, obviously, a lot of kids showed up, and it was organized that, hey, be there, kind of thing. And I give the city council credit for you're listening, and the mayor is listening. And so things are happening, and I think a lot of these discussions are worthwhile, and just have to see what comes out of them. I hope they're not like the National Grid where it's baked in already and there's not much we can do with. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the National Grid conversations in, looking at this transmission line that's slated to go through downtown and approved at the state level for that, I've been learning a lot through the public meetings so far, and we have another one on the 19th that's going to be at the middle school with remote access, so people who might not be comfortable or have scheduling challenges to get to a physical meeting can join remotely as well and give their suggestions, their ideas, and their questions. While the route has been approved at the state level, we still have a lot of conversations to be had at the council about what impact that construction work could have downtown and how we can mitigate the impact on the public of that work. So I think I still have a lot of open questions, and the National Grid team has been answering them. They've been sending a lot of documents. We're getting all those up on the city website so people can see what the conversation is, and hopefully in a couple weeks we'll get more.
You just talked yourself into a return visit. I hope you will take the invitation.
Of course.
And we've hit the magic number. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching us this evening. And we'll do some more of this. I mean, these issues that keep coming up, and they're worth talking about, and give you a chance to get involved. And again, after the credits is my email address. If you got some comments, please send them to me. And if you have another point of view and you want to sit at the table and explain it, hey, there's room for you anytime. Thanks again. Good evening.